Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to kick off this conference with some of my favorite friends and colleagues. Before we begin our conversation today, and I promise you it will be a conversation, we'll have lots of time for Q&A, which Trillium will moderate for us. I want to show you a short video that I think suggests one of the significant challenges of our era in teaching and learning. So can we see that first video, please? I like to begin keynotes with that film because I think it raises some very profound questions. As you know, the theme of this conference this year is engaged learners. But I think the prior questions we need to ask is, engage them for what, in preparation for what? The world is being profoundly disrupted. Artificial intelligence, the taking of jobs is only being accelerated by COVID. And so I think the most fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that we human beings can uniquely do that computers cannot do? And how do we best prepare young people for this new world and to develop their fullest capabilities? You know, I began teaching in 1971, high school English teacher. And at the time, it was the twilight of the industrial era. And people were talking about the new knowledge economy and the need for knowledge workers. Well, you know, Peter Drucker coined that term in 1969, 50 years ago. A lot of people still think we have a knowledge economy, but I believe that's mistaken. We live in the innovation era. What's the difference? Knowledge has now become a commodity, growing exponentially, changing constantly, worth only as much as your capability of making sense of that knowledge. In fact, the world really no longer cares how much our graduates know. What the world cares about is what they can do with what they know, which is a brand new and completely different education problem. And it has profound implications for the employability of this next generation. Let me give you a couple of examples. You know, Google used to only hire kids from Ivy League colleges and only interview those who had the highest test scores and GPAs. Well, along comes Laszlo Bock, Senior VP of People Operations at the time, analyzes the data and discovers that all of the indices they had been using for hiring and promotion were, quote, worthless, unquote, his words. He went on to say the skills you need to succeed in a competitive academic environment bear no relationship to the skills you need to succeed in the innovation economy. So what has Google done? They stopped asking for your college degree. They stopped asking for the transcript. They stopped asking for test scores. 15% of Google's new hires now don't have a BA degree at all. And that trend is growing dramatically among corporations and businesses, both large and small. Another example, I was in Ho Chi Minh City a few years ago at the invitation of Deloitte, the accounting and consulting firm, and had lunch with the CEO who knew of my prior affiliation to Harvard and affiliated at the time. And she said, with a kind of a wry smile, she said, you know, we used to hire the best students from the best universities, but we don't do that anymore because it turns out they don't work out so well. She said, now we look for good students, but we put them through a summer-long boot camp to see how they solve problems collaboratively. And then we decide whether or not to offer them a job. So the question to me is, how do we best prepare young people for the innovation era? First, let's get clear about what is innovation and what I think we can and cannot do. When I researched this for my book, Creating Innovators, which was published in 2012, the first thing I came to learn is that there are really two very different kinds of innovation. One is about bringing new possibilities to life. Think of Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. I don't believe you can educate someone to be one of those folks. In fact, all three of them were college dropouts. But there's another kind of innovation every bit as important, and that is to be a creative problem solver. And increasingly, I'm finding around the world, whether it's in health or education or in government or in nonprofits and for-profits, the capacity to solve problems creatively is the coin of realm. Now, here's the good news. We are born curious, creative, imaginative. That is the human DNA. The average 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day. And I'm reminded of that because I now have 4 grandchildren. And those kids also think of themselves as artists, all of them. They love to draw and color. But then something happens. We call it school. Because you see, the longer kids are in school, the fewer questions they ask, the more they become obsessed with getting the right answers. And fewer and fewer think of themselves as creative in any way. So what must we do differently? Well, that's a question I posed to a number of young people initially in interviews, all of whom had been recognized as creative problem solvers. I wanted to know what was different about their background, about their parenting, about their schooling. So I did extensive interviews. I interviewed an equal number of young men and young women. I interviewed some from privilege, some from poverty, some who had just recently immigrated to the US, and others of whom had been here for many generations. And later I extended those interviews beyond to young people in many other countries. And obviously one of the first questions that I was most interested in was about their education. Well, that was the first troubling finding. You see, some of these kids had gone to what are supposed to be leading universities, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, to be specific. And they all told me they had become successful creative problem solvers in spite of their schooling, not because of it. But I persisted. I said, hasn't there been at least one teacher who's made a difference for you? And they could all name at least one. Not rarely more than a couple, but at least one. And the grade range of those teachers was kindergarten to graduate school. So I went and interviewed all of those teachers to see if I could see some kind of pattern of their teaching. And the interesting thing that I learned was they were all outliers in their system, teaching in ways that were fundamentally different than their peers, yet remarkably similar to one another. Then I spent time interviewing and observing in those few schools and colleges that in fact really do teach creative problem solving and are known for it. I went to the MIT Media Lab. I went to the then new Olin College of Engineering. I went to the D School at Stanford. I went to, High Tech High, New Tech High, Envisions, Expeditionary Learning. And way back at the youngest ages, I went to visit Montessori schools and Reggio Emilia schools. And the pattern from Reggio Emilia to MIT's Media Lab, the pattern of teaching and learning was stunningly similar and very similar to how my outlier teachers were also teaching. So out of this, what I came to understand is that there's a very dramatic difference between the kinds of teaching and learning that still dominate the world, which is a product of the industrial era. It's kind of a conveyor belt, assembly line approach. And the kind of teaching and learning that I saw that prepared young people to be successful creative problem solvers. 5 contradictions I'm going to briefly talk about. Contradiction number 1, conventional schooling is all about celebrating, rewarding, and measuring individual achievement. Well, certainly there's a place for that. But all of these teachers and all of these organizations emphasized teamwork because they know that's what adults have to do. Accountable teamwork, not this group work where one kid does all the work. Accountable teamwork where kids evaluated one another's contributions to the team and work accountable to the team. Contradiction number 2 are the ways in which we compartmentalize knowledge and silo subject content according to a scheme that was really born at the dawn of the 20th century called Carnegie units. Well, it turns out that innovation is not only a team sport, innovation demands a multidisciplinary approach to problem solving. As someone at Google told me, said, you cannot solve a single problem with just one academic discipline. Knowing this, these teachers in these more innovative schools designed interdisciplinary courses where teams worked on real problems or big questions. Contradiction number 3 is about the culture of the classroom. The culture of the classroom in conventional schools so often is a culture of compliance. It's a culture of passivity, of consumption. The culture of the innovation-driven classrooms is radically different. It's a culture where students are expected to question received wisdom, expected to question authority, where they're expected to take initiative, and where the teacher sees his or her role not as so much the expert, the sage on stage, but rather as a performance coach and a mentor, coaching students to higher performance standards. Contradictions 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging of all for us. You see, contradiction 4 is all about the F word in schools. Failure, worst thing that can happen. How do you fail? Well, you make more mistakes than the person next to you. We create a bell curve based on how many errors or mistakes people have made. The lower your grade, the more mistakes you make. Well, here's the problem. Not only does that create extraordinary stress and increasing levels of anxiety among our young people, but it also is in total contradiction to the innovation era. Innovation demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes, and that you fail. I went to IDEO, the most innovative design company in the world. Turns out the company motto is fail early, fail often. Imagine if that was our motto in schools. You know, other companies talk about fail fast, fail forward, fail cheap, fail smart, but fail. Now, obviously, they're not talking about failing in quite an academic sense. What they're talking about is the methodology of innovation, which at its heart is trial and error, going from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0, learning from mistakes, applying what you've learned. Now, not only is this kind of at the heart of the world of innovation, I think it's at the heart of all learning. How do infants learn to speak or to walk? Trial and error. Well, what would happen if we said to a young person learning to walk, I'm sorry, no crawling, that's not allowed. You can only walk until you can stand up and walk in a straight line, and no gibberish. We want complete sentences that are grammatically correct. I'm bicycle riding, completely out of the question, because we know you're going to fall on skinny. No. If I were live with you this morning and could see your faces, I would ask you one simple question: to raise your hand if you've learned more from your mistakes than your successes. Well, I can certainly count myself as that. I recently wrote a memoir called Learning by Heart, an Unconventional Education, and it's much more a chronicle of all the mistakes I made and what I learned from them than it is so much a record of my successes. It's brutally honest, too. So, back to contradiction 4 for a minute. What's the alternative to the bell curve? Well, increasingly, I've come to believe the alternative to the bell curve is a mastery-based learning system. What does that mean? That means that you work towards a level of proficiency that has been clearly identified, and you get a credit, or think of it as a scouting badge, once you've reached that level of proficiency. I actually did that in many of my classes. The only 3 grades that were available in my classes were A, B, or incomplete. The only F I acknowledged was the failure not to show up, not to try at all. I considered a student's work to be incomplete until they'd reached this level of proficiency. How did I know they were proficient? I, back then, had every student keep a paper portfolio. And I would conference with them regularly, collect their portfolios, and I saw, of course, their demonstrations of mastery in their oral work in the classroom. Rarely do we see someone whose work is outstanding, who's excellent, clearly superior. That's what I think an A should be for. You know, that is, in fact, how the adult world works. How do you become a plumber? How do you become an electrician? How do you get your driver's license? You show proficiency. And you don't get that license until you have reached a level of proficiency. I mean, really, do you want to fly with a C- airline pilot? You know, a pilot who's gotten pretty good on the takeoffs, but hasn't figured out this landing thing? That's not how the adult world works. Why then should school be any different? The damage we're doing in trying to artificially rank kids by how quick and clever some are, when in fact, if we give kids more time and support, they can all or nearly all reach proficiency. To me, that's the alternative. A high school diploma should be a certificate of mastery. And in fact, I serve on the board of something called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, mastery.org. And it's a collection of 330 high schools from around the world, both public and independent, that are developing exactly this, a mastery-based transcript, and engaging with colleges and universities to make this a new and very different kind of way of capturing what students can really do and who they really are, And it's critical that we do this, particularly now in the time of COVID. And we have this great crack in the cosmic egg where many, many colleges, 1,600 at last count, don't any longer require test scores. So I think this is a huge opportunity for innovation. And I urge you to look at Mastery Transcript Consortium. So to the last contradiction, and that is the contradiction around motivation. How do we motivate kids in school? Well, all too often, with the exception of the rare teacher or the rare class, we motivate kids through carrots and sticks. Goes right back to grading, rewards and punishments, extrinsic incentives. But what I've come to learn is that innovation and the most successful innovators and creative problem solvers are far more intrinsically motivated. They do their best work when it's work worth doing. They seek jobs where they can make a difference. So I wanted to try to understand where had that come from? What did it kind of strengthen that in these young people? So as I mentioned earlier, I interviewed all of their parents and teachers as well. And I went back and went through the research. I discovered a pattern. Both parents and teachers of these successful young problem solvers had explicitly encouraged three things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraged exploratory play, more time outside, fewer toys, less screen time, toys without batteries. Teachers created a space for what I call disciplined play in their classes, where kids could explore new possibilities, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. As these kids grew older, the parents were encouraging them to constantly explore new interests, new ideas, new possibilities, in the hopes that they would discover a real interest that might evolve into a passion. These parents understood that to develop what is Angela Duckworth calls grit, perseverance, tenacity, all of these things that we know are critical for adult success. How do you do that? We know that they're important, but how do you do it? I think from the research I've done, it's very clear. These parents believe that the best way for these young people to develop the grit, the perseverance, the tenacity was to pursue a real interest that would become a passion. And teachers also made time in their classes for young people to pursue real interests in these innovation-driven schools and classrooms. But passion morphs, it evolves. It's not enough. But in every case with the young people whom I have interviewed now, and there are many dozens, that passion evolves into a deeper sense of purpose, a desire to give back and to make a difference. We all know this because teaching is as much a calling as it is a profession. Many of us were drawn to teaching to also make a difference. And these parents and teachers had made that very explicit. They had sort of created a moral foundation, not necessarily religious-based, but with the idea that we are not here simply on this earth to serve ourselves. We have some responsibility to give back and make a difference. And that's what most motivated all of these young innovators whom I interviewed and profiled. So let me conclude before we have some Q&A about things you might want to consider and do back in your schools. I think the first most important thing is to imagine a diploma, whether it's a college diploma, a high school diploma, a middle school diploma, even an elementary diploma, as a certificate of mastery. Today, what do these diplomas stand for? All of them. They are certificates of seat time served. How much time did you spend? That's what we call credit hours or Carnegie units. And a grade is merely an indication of how well you've served your seat time. It is not in any way a certificate of proficiency, a certificate of mastery. So I deeply believe we have to reconfigure how we think about diplomas. And that requires us to sit down together and research and understand the content knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions that matter most. We can't set proficiency standards until we're clear about proficient at what. To be very, very clear, I believe academic content knowledge still matters for lots of reasons, and I'm sure I don't have to convince you of that. But in the 21st century, because knowledge has become a commodity and can be looked up anywhere, skills matter more. Skills of critical thinking, being able to ask really good questions, is at the heart of creative problem solving. Collaboration is critical. Communication, of course, and creative problem solving. So we have to define the skills and also the dispositions. Academic content knowledge matters, skills matter more, motivation matters most. So we have to do the hard, challenging work of defining what a graduate should know and be able to do. EdLeader 21 has some great tools for that, for creating a profile of a graduate. That's edleader21.org. Then the harder part comes in assessment. See, it does very little good if we create a profile of a graduate with, grandiose aspirations, but don't tie assessments to them. So I think we're going to have to think long and hard about not being so data-driven, but more evidence-based. A test is a snapshot in time. Doesn't tell you a lot. A digital portfolio, on the other hand, where you see a progressive record of a young person's developing mastery, I believe should be the basis for all of the assessment. Collective human judgment, collective, not individual, informed by evidence, I think will ultimately be the absolute best way we can assess student work. And that requires us to kind of rethink and reimagine how we work together. It can't be an individual human judgment. That's often too capricious. It has to be collective. So then I think the next opportunity, once we think about assessment and digital portfolios, by the way, are at the heart of the Mastery Transcripts Consortium's new transcript. Then I think the question is, how do we incent or encourage innovations in school? Top-down change simply doesn't work. That creates compliance. We know that. So it has to be a combination of some top-down initiatives with bottom-up initiatives. And one of the things that I have proposed and that some schools have done is create an innovation fund to which teams of teachers can apply. Why teams? Teams will iterate more quickly, they'll take more responsible risks than will individuals. Teams of teachers creating new interdisciplinary courses. Teams of teachers creating better end of semester assessments, or even, as you'll see in the video in just a moment, opportunities where students can present and defend their work to adults. These are the kinds of innovations that I think are critically needed and cannot be mandated. So if you're a teacher right now and saying, all right, I can't do all of that right now. I'm just a teacher. What can I do this minute? I would like to offer two proposals. First is encourage your students to keep a question journal. Curiosity, I am learning, is at the very heart of innovation. All of the innovators whom I've met have one thing in common. They're all curious. And sadly, I think the longer kids are in school, the less curious they appear, or perhaps have even, their curiosity is withered. So curiosity begins with being more intentional and conscious about your questions, your concerns, and for us as adults as well. And then give kids a little bit of time to actually research the questions that interest them or explore a new interest. You know, you call it Google time, whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's 5% of the curriculum, 10% initially, but it's a starting point. And my friend Ted Dintersmith has done a wonderful new website called whatschoolcanbe.org, What School Can Be, which is the title of his terrific book, where he documents all these kind of things as ways of starting, of creating sparks in your school. So these are some of the things that I believe we can do and that are being done in schools all over the country. But let me end this part of my talk by giving you a little glimpse of what it actually looks like in a classroom. High Tech High is a network of charter schools, K-12 in San Diego, with its own graduate school of education. And it's very different than other charter schools. Students are selected by lottery and by zip code at High Tech High. They're not, just plucked out. So what that means is that the student population there is broadly representative of the population of San Diego, predominantly minority, about half the kids on free and reduced lunch. Now, this is a school that has very different priorities. There are no varsity sports, no big gyms, no playing fields. All their money goes into the classroom. There's intramural sports, of course. Another difference is that all classes, virtually all, are team taught. And Larry Rosenstock, the founder of High Tech High, who's since retired, told me a long time ago that, of all the innovations that he put into the school, the importance of team teaching was critical because teaching becomes transparent. And in fact, in their buildings, there is always at least one glass wall in every classroom. The expectation is people are going to help each other improve. So we're going to see a very quick video from our film, Most Likely to Succeed. If you haven't seen that film, that's a great starting point for community-based conversations, Most Likely to Succeed. It's on all of the streaming platforms. We're going to see a 5-minute clip of a 9th grade class. 9th grade class taught by 2 teachers, one who's humanities, history and English, and one who's science and math, and a little engineering thrown in there as well. What I want you to listen and look for in this 5-minute clip are 3 things. What content knowledge is being taught? Number 1, content matters. Number 2, what skills are being taught? Skills matter more. And number 3, how are students being motivated to do their best work? Because motivation matters most. So let's see that short video, and then I'm going to come back and look forward to questions and conversation.
The philosophy of High Tech High is founded largely on the idea of kids making, doing, building, shaping, and inventing stuff. The engineers that I know, the architects I know, the artists I know, the great educators that I know, the entrepreneurs that I know, are all sort of perplexed and curious about how they can do it better the next time. And that type of perplexity leads to engagement. It leads to learning. It leads to innovation. We are trying to have that type of perplexity and curiosity get inculcated in our students in everyday practices.
In both Linkabit and Qualcomm, one of our problems was being able to hire enough qualified people, enough trained people. And so it was kind of a long-term view to set up High Tech High.
Oh, I don't think it's like the flu word. I think I know. And
like if you have tooth spacing at 0.01, the gears won't connect at all.
We didn't know that it was all going to work until maybe 4 weeks before exhibition, 3 weeks.
I mean, we knew that pieces of it were working, and even those pieces were impressive.
We had to learn about civilizations, the Mayans, the Romans, and the Greeks. And Scott and Mike didn't want to just teach us this. So they came up with this big wheel, which is a big gear, which has a lot of drawings on it, and is connected to all these other mechanisms, and they each represented our theory. So I learned about the Mayans, the Greeks, and the Romans, and I really based my theory off of the Romans.
And why so?
Because it has to do with expanding. They were always expanding, and what I realized is that they were expanding not because not just for the fun of it, but they needed resources for all the people back home, Italy and all the ones that they all the new places that they took over.
Then they had to, on their own, develop and defend an idea on why they think civilizations rise and fall.
So we had to create like a flow chart just explaining what our theory was, and then we got critiques on it, and then we created a group one.
Another piece is on the mechanical side. They need to take what's already an abstract concept with their theory, and they have to take that and actually physically manifest it. They have some very preliminary metrics they need to use. They know that there's going to be a big wheel turning at a certain RPM. They know how many teeth that is, so they have basically a box to work within, some bounds to work within, and they have to make everything.
Yeah, I can get it.
I put the wrong side in. Oh my God.
So we have an exhibition that we're preparing for right now, and it'll be tomorrow night, and there will be thousands of people here looking at student work, students presenting their work, visitors looking at the work, students presenting their work to each other. And I think that idea of making work public, that's a missing piece to me in schools in general.
For most of you, this is probably the biggest project that you've ever exhibited. A lot of you, it's the first project that you've ever really had a public exhibition of. All right? Cool. We're going to be here. If you need to go, we understand, but we're going to keep working for a few hours. Break.
This idea of sort of making something and having a public exhibition and having people come look at it. And you have that feeling that we all have, like, how did they do that?
You really need to understand it, and you really need to understand why you need to know this to be able to complete the project.
What astounded me was that while doing research, my theory, it actually fit with a lot of these civilizations. It wasn't just like some random theory.
When kids have that feeling, it's transformative for them. I made this, and everyone's coming to look at it.
We do have a lot of great questions coming through and a lot of engagement in the chat. So thank you so much for the inspiring talk this morning as we get going here. One of the questions that has come through is about the link between the end of secondary education and the university system. And you talked about the new ways of thinking about diplomas. But what kind of movement are you seeing at the university level to consider things differently? Because we can prepare kids in our schools, but will they be well received when they go on to other kinds of education?
Well, as many people know, a very considerably growing number of colleges and universities are seeking to give up test scores for admissions. The entire University of California system has gone off from tests. This year, Harvard is not requiring any test scores. As I mentioned, there are 1,600 colleges and universities. University of Chicago, academically, probably one of the most rigorous schools in the country, said no more test scores, test optional. Why is that? That's because they know that tests are highly biased. Rich parents hire tutors and get kids' scores up. Too often test scores screen out highly talented and gifted kids who are simply not very good test takers. So I think we're seeing, especially with the Mastery Transcript Consortium's work, a growing body of interest among colleges and universities who want a different way to look at kids. And that's what we're trying to do with the Mastery Transcript.
Great, thank you. We also have a lot of questions in the chat about some more practical applications to what you've just talked about. People loved the idea of the question journal. What are some other tips could teachers and schools take back right away after today? What are some things they could do even if the structures that surround them are still very traditional and somewhat rigid? What else could they do to at least get started?
Well, that's why I mentioned the question journal, because you can do that in the context of any curriculum or any school, no matter how traditional. I think thinking about end of semester projects is a huge opportunity where students have to apply what they've learned. You know, a great example, I watched, I came into a private school that had just finished all of the advanced placement classes. And the teacher had a couple of weeks left in a science class. I can't remember which one it was. And so she was kind of scratched her head and said, well, now what do I do? Very traditional school in Oklahoma, I believe. And so she said, okay, kids, you memorized the theory or the definition of a hypothesis. Now what I want you to do is team up, develop a hypothesis, design an experiment to go test it, and then we're going to have a day where everybody showcases their work. Well, I followed these two students whose hypothesis was that there would be more bacteria on the surfaces of fast food restaurants than on the surfaces of higher end restaurants. Interesting hypothesis. So they collected the samples, they analyzed the data and discovered, in fact, there was no difference. But it's a wonderful example of students having to learn what science is by doing it.
Yeah, that's great. And that ties into some other questions in the chat about, how do you begin to get students to think differently about what they're capable of and what kind of thinking they can do when they have been trained to be compliant?
It's a challenge everywhere. You know, when I worked first in public schools and worked with most at-risk kids, and I would always ask them, what are you interested in learning? I could, help them do anything related to reading and writing. I didn't have to follow a curriculum because these were in-school dropouts. And basically people didn't pay attention to what I was doing with them. And what I learned was that some kids could tell me almost right away, I'm interested in X. Other kids took 6 months or longer, but I kept asking. I persisted. I vividly remember, and I think I tell this story in my memoir, continuing to work with this kid. Every week he kind of can't come up zero, no reading, no writing. Kept asking him, what do you want to learn? What are you interested in? He finally said, I work on my car a lot. I'm kind of wondering, what's the difference between a carbureted engine and a fuel injected engine? So he started doing research. He started reading. And then he wrote a paper about the differences. So it was my persistence, I think, my faith that if I kept asking that question, he would eventually come around. And he did.
That's a great story. Since you've mentioned your memoir, I'm curious, this is a question for me and not from the chat, but I'm curious, what kind of learner were you as a child?
Well, I'll give you a sneak preview of attractions. I hated school. I dropped out of high school my senior year. I dropped out of college twice and became very involved in the 60s, coming of age in the 60s, where, the threat of nuclear war was our COVID, and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King was our George Floyd moment. Had a profound mark on me. I finally graduated from a small experimental college where I could study the things that most interested me, and then went to Harvard for a master's and then later a doctorate. But I became a teacher in part to try to be the kind of teacher I wished I'd had growing up. And that's a lot of what's motivated me. But if I could, there's one more point I would like to make. I want to speak to the present moment in education. and how we can respond to our kids every day in front of us. And it also goes to your question of what can we do now? As I mentioned, I grew up in a time of turmoil, tremendous turmoil, coming of age in the 60s. And there were three things that I sought in that time that I believe kids today also desperately want and need. Three things. Number one, community. I needed to know I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy in my fears and my anxieties, in my aspirations. Joining a civil rights group gave me some sense of community. But I think teachers today have to work to create community in their classrooms where kids not only feel safe, but feel heard. The second thing I needed was some choice in what I was learning. What's the history of racism? Was the Vietnam War really a civil war or a war against communist aggression? I wanted to know those things. And so the opportunity to learn those things while gaining the skills of research and critical reasoning and so on was vitally important to me back in the 60s. And then thirdly, voice. I needed opportunities to express my views, have them challenged, to both give voice to thought and feelings. You know, the alternative newspapers that flourished back then, the alternative magazines, gave us as young people opportunities for voice. And in fact, I published my very first articles in some of these alternative magazines at the age of 21. And it was tremendously validating. So we have to find ways of, I think, today, meeting kids' tremendous fears and anxieties. And they're overwhelming. I recently tweeted an article about high school kids' anxieties today by giving them community, voice, and choice.
Those are really important points. Thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing a little bit of your personal story. Now I really have to read your book.
Well, you can also listen to it if you'd rather. I narrate the memoir, and I have really great fun doing it because I love reading aloud.
Oh, that's great. Another question for you is, do you have any tips or ideas about how learning communities can work with other aspects of their community in terms of employers or startups or other innovative different types of industries in their area to match up what's going on in the real world with what's being learned in school?
It's a great question. I think as a part of developing a profile of a graduate, it's really important to interview employers and to videotape those interviews and bring them back to school so that teachers, students, and parents can see them. Because when you hear an employer talk about the skills that matter most, it's enormously helpful. As many of you know, what is still my most popular book, The Global Achievement Gap, really begins with a series of interviews of senior executives and what skills matter most to them. So I think that's a vital part of the research you do to create a profile of a graduate. But I also think we need to create opportunities for work-based internships for every single kid. High Tech High requires a semester-long internship. And kids sometimes find that what they thought interested them ends up not being so interesting, and vice versa. They discover a real passion. But more importantly, I think it's the opportunity for young people to be around adults in the adult world and to understand what their expectations will be. When I taught ninth grade, I actually required my students to shadow an adult in a job for a day, and then to come back and write both a written report and then give an oral presentation on what they learned about what that adult did and what the skills were that mattered. So I think these are some of the ways in which we can bring the world of work into classrooms.
Great ideas. I love that in our chat, if I keep glancing over, we've got lots of people sharing some of their own resources and ideas as well, and sharing some of the things that you've mentioned, some of the links to that. So it's a real community effort here during this session, which is fantastic. You mentioned a little bit about bringing those videos back from industry and so forth. What are some other ways to engage parents in this conversation, knowing that, especially in in private schools, they have a lot of choice over the schools that they choose for their students, and they know a lot of them are looking for a certain pathway to a certain kind of university. So they're obviously important stakeholders.
I think there's two different issues. Yeah, I get that question a lot, particularly in the independent school world. I think one of the things that we need to help parents understand is that the ways in which one gets a competitive advantage today, that path does not necessarily lead through an Ivy League school. Let's first begin by understanding parents today are extremely anxious, even before COVID, let alone now. They see a world that is far more competitive than the one they grew up in. And so they're anxious to give a competitive advantage. And the traditional solution to that problem is through elite schools, right? And the problem with that solution is, number one, kids' anxieties and stress levels are absolutely through the roof. There's just a growing documentation of all of that. But number two, the competition to get into these schools gets harder every single year because the applicant pool gets so much larger from around the world. And number three, the real competitive advantage actually comes from young people developing a real interest in developing their capabilities. As I mentioned before, Google doesn't care what your grade point average or test score was. The first question, and they don't even look for a paper trail. They do extended structured interviews. And the first question they're going to ask is, tell me about a difficult problem you solved. So we need to help parents understand that for their kids to find a niche and thrive in the adult world, less stress is better than more. Less preoccupation with this narrow, thin little road to an Ivy League school is really better. Less stress on that. Let's focus on that. And more time developing kids' real interests and real passions so that they become fuller human beings and will find the right college or even a trade program, and they will continue to thrive and flourish as adults.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So I'd like to ask you, with the disruption that's going on in education because of the pandemic, what is one thing that you hope will get thrown out, or it's one thing we see doing in education because we have this opportunity to rethink the way things are done?
Well, what is being thrown out are high stakes tests and test scores. And I think that provides us with a huge opportunity to focus less on this snapshot, as I mentioned, and more on the movie. The movie is the growing evolution of kids' mastery and competence. To me, that is the key to the transformation of our education. And it's something that schools are doing today all over the world, and it's very exciting. And I want to simply end with a thank you to all of the educators in the audience. My favorite quote is from the early pages of A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens. He says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." These are stunningly challenging times for educators all over the world. Now COVID making things that much worse. And I know and feel that pain. I hear it every day from my friends who are in the classroom. But I also have this opportunity, this bird's eye view, that enables me to say it's simultaneously the best of times. Because I see incredible innovations. I see educators working together to solve problems creatively and collaboratively. So I simply want to thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for all that you do for kids every single day.
Thank you so much for all of your insights and your time and expertise today. We really appreciate it.
No, it's been a great pleasure. I only wish I could actually see the audience.
I know. Well, they're very engaged on the chat, and you can take a look once you go off screen. So
if folks want to get in touch with me, I'm at tonywagner.com. That's my website. My Twitter handle is at Dr. Tony Wagner. The DR is there because Tony Wagner was already taken. and I'm Tony Tony@TonyWagner.com is my my email. So I look forward to hearing from you and to staying.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
My great pleasure.